The next phase of our plan to deliver the greatest economy in history is for this Congress to pass tax cuts for everybody.
That's Donald Trump on March 4th, announcing his new plan to cut taxes across all brackets.
I'm sure you're going to vote for those tax cuts, because otherwise I don't believe the people will ever vote you into office. So I'm doing
The Senate responded with thunderous applause.
But I know this group is going to be voting for the tax cuts.
As of this taping, Republicans are preparing Trump's new tax cut, one that's expected to cut $5 trillion in taxes. Most of those are for the richest Americans and corporations. It's also expected to add $5.7 trillion to the national deficit. And it's still unclear whether Trump and the Republicans are going to end up cutting vital services like Social Security and Medicare to pay for them. But this isn't a new story. Ever since I was born in 1992, Republican presidents have passed tax cuts every single time they've been in office.
I firmly believe that those tax cuts were part of that engine for that economic vitality.
By the time I was in high school, George W. Bush had slashed taxes twice, and then he launched 2 wars, ballooning the national deficit and kicking off a period of economic anxiety.
The economy is not doing as well as we'd like it to do today. Our response is, let's make those tax cuts permanent.
Even as a high schooler, I knew it always came down to one thing: who's going to raise people's taxes? It's become so normal for Republicans to cut taxes now that in the last election, it felt like it was just a given that Trump would pass some kind of tax cut. And when he entered office, that's exactly what the new Congress set out to work on. But why? It's not just Republicans. One poll published in April found that 59% of Americans think that they pay too much in federal income taxes, and only 46% think their taxes are fair. But this is a tricky question. I'd wager most of us would prefer to save money and pay less taxes. But taxes are more than just what we give away.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens.
Taxes fund the society many Americans feel patriotic about. They're how we fund infrastructure, education, and war. It's how our government spends our taxes that's a reflection of our priorities. And in a democracy, that means it's a reflection of what the public wants. That's why for a long time, a lot of Republicans were okay with them. Republicans of the past were budget hawks, but they still saw the need for a tax to fund a civic society. But in the 1970s, that seemed to change. A new movement began to emerge in America. One that was cloaked in the new gospel of an economic theory known as supply-side economics. A theory that envisioned a country free of taxation and full of prosperity.
It was the supply-side revolution. It went from the U.S. to all these other countries, and God, you could see the huge change in the prosperity of the U.S.
But that's not the country we ended up with. Today, income inequality is at a historic high. Wealth is concentrating at the top, and our country is literally run by billionaires who are debating whether they should cut the services millions depend on to cover their bottom line.
We don't live in a democracy, we live in a bureaucracy.
It feels like the twilight years of what has been one of the larger yet little discussed revolutions in modern politics, the tax revolt. I'm Arjun Singh. For the next few weeks on Lever Time, we're going to bring you the inside story of the anti-tax movement. And as Lever Time's new reporter Ariella Markowitz found out, this conservative revolution against taxes started in the grassroots and in a state you'd never expect.
California. Of course it's California. Home to Silicon Valley, neoliberals, Apple and Microsoft screensavers. Oh yeah, and the tax revolt.
Set this scene a little bit. You've been in California, you're researching this anti-tax movement. Now, I'm all there with you that this state has somehow gotten a very liberal image when it's really not. I did not realize that this would be the home base of people who just didn't want to pay taxes.
Well, yeah. I mean, in the late 60s and early 70s, California was prime for a conservative anti-tax revolution. Ronald Reagan was governor, and he was this kindly TV host and ex-movie star. And he won in the late 60s on a platform to restore law and order to the tumultuous state. And around that time, taxes are about as high as they'd ever been. But the secret sauce that really kickstarts the tax revolt is the sweat and willpower of one man, Howard Jarvis. He actually had a cameo in the 1980 comedy film Airplane.
Wait, the one with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the pilot?
Yep, that's the one. But yeah, in the movie, the taxi driver hero of the film, played by Robert Hayes, dashes off to catch a flight, leaving a guy in the cab with the meter running. The customer is an older gentleman with thick glasses and sagging jowls that Time magazine beautifully described as perpetually threatening to sweep over the knot of his tie. He checks his watch as his cab fare racks up to over $100.
Well, I'll give him another 20 minutes. But that's it.
It's just like a post-credits gag, but it's way funnier if you recognize the guy.
We have a new revolution against the arrogant politicians and insensitive bureaucrats whose philosophy of tax, spend.
So he was a really pissed off, angry guy, and especially about taxes.
Yep, exactly. Howard Jarvis liked to say that he was mad as hell.
Wait, that line that he got from the movie Network, did he steal that?
Yeah, he was pretty influenced by that film. Howard Jarvis was the leader of California's taxpayer revolt that produced an amendment to the state constitution. That initiative, Prop 13, passed in 1978. It limited property taxes, but also the state's ability to create new taxes. And the movement caught on.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Howard Jarvis is going to influence decades of political action and thought, but at first he's just a relatively unknown guy. He's a conservative business owner living in LA, frustrated by what he sees as excessive taxation. And one of the people I talked to for this story is one of the nation's leading experts on the life and times of Howard Jarvis.
Howard Jarvis really began separating the us who pay taxes from the them who live off of them.
That's Michael Gratz. He started his career in Nixon's Treasury Department.
I saw politics up close. It was somewhat ugly then, but it's gotten much uglier since.
Now he's a retired professor from Yale and Columbia Law Schools, and he's written a handful of books on the subject of taxation. He told me he was getting lunch with his editor one day when she pitched him a new idea, a history of the modern anti-tax movement.
And I said, well, everybody knows about the anti-tax movement. Why would I do that? And then we had lunch. And by the end of lunch, she had convinced me that it was worth writing.
That book became The Power to Destroy: How the Anti-Tax Movement Hijacked America. Gratz started his story with Howard Jarvis in 1978, so that's where I wanted to start too. Getting to know Howard Jarvis. Hoja.
He was a rough-hewn sort of looking fellow, but he had his points and he knew how to make them and he knew how to connect with people.
We, the people, not the politicians, are still the boss.
He was on radio shows overnight constantly. You could hardly miss him on television in California.
Jarvis preached to the power of the people, but he also stoked the fears of the middle class, like in this interview on BCTV.
We have a tax system in the United States that manufactures poor people. That's what it does.
Jarvis dabbled in politics his entire adult life, but he came across like a simple old man, a product of the Great Depression. The news at the time, like CBS, focused mainly on his age.
Unassuming, unrecognized 75-year-old Howard Jarvis certainly doesn't look like the man who has just about every established politician in the state scared to death.
He wore cheap suits that, according to his former aide, he bought on sale at the discount store. He'd often set them on fire by sticking his lit corncob pipe in his pocket. He drank cheap vodka, despite being raised Mormon, and his favorite food was, allegedly, 1 can of Del Monte creamed corn, mixed into a cup of whole milk, simmered to just below boiling, and plopped into a bowl. He sometimes used old-timey racial slurs to describe his political opponents, which was a bit spicy for the time. One of the first things I did when I started researching this series was ordered his hard copy vintage autobiography off of Amazon.
Is it even a good book?
Honestly, I loved reading it. It was written as like just a super punchy manifesto. It has all of these outlandish claims in it, and he loves to exaggerate for dramatic effect. And it's honestly a great read. My favorite chapter is called How I Got to Be Mad as Hell, which is basically his whole life story that made him hate taxes and the government.
Like, who is this guy?
Yeah, he was born in a very rural town in Utah, but that didn't stop him from bumping shoulders with a bunch of famous people. Eisenhower, Earl Warren. Jarvis also claimed to have sparred with Jack Dempsey, who's the US former heavyweight champion, which kind of speaks to his old-time fighting spirit. He buys a local newspaper and kind of publishes popular columns, clickbaity articles about corruption, whiskey racketeering.
Nice. Early era Breitbart.
Yeah. And then he goes on to move to LA, and he makes some very interesting claims there about starting the political career of Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Please tell me in this book he also is the one who told Nixon to say, "I am not a crook."
He doesn't claim that, but the guy likes to spin a yarn. During World War II, Jarvis started using latex to manufacture felt coverings for typewriters and business equipment. But Japan invaded Singapore, the center of the world's rubber production.
We must rely more heavily on scrap rubber. Your scrap rubber.
One day, government employees came to his factory and confiscated his latex to use for the war.
For Howard Jarvis, taking away his property was personal.
Jarvis claimed to even visit the warehouse where the government took his latex, and he saw that it had all expired. It was basically useless mush.
Now, we've had a phony thing grow up in the United States that says human rights are more important than property rights.
There's some real emotion in Jarvis's voice in this BCTV interview. The voice of a man whose property was stolen and wasted.
The most important human right there is the right to own property. Without that, he doesn't have any right really worth talking about. It's essential to freedom. It's the most important human right there is.
In the early 1960s, Jarvis sold his manufacturing businesses. He spent over a year on the road campaigning for state senator and lost. He was ready to retire from politics. He even bought a boat and was going to move to the Bahamas. But the story goes that he got mixed up in taxes and never went. It's 1962. Jarvis attended an important meeting with a group of about 20 homeowners. Most of them were in their 50s and 60s. They gathered around a living room table just talking about how high their property taxes were. One woman, Leona Magidson, a widow with a skyrocketing tax bill and a fixed income, wanted to do something about it. She offered her home in West LA as the headquarters of a new movement. These elders wanted to organize to fight high property taxes, and Howard stepped up to be their leader. To Jarvis, this issue was literally life and death. In his early work, Jarvis claimed to see a lady die in the LA County Hall of Administration pleading relief for her high tax bill. But at this point, I gotta make some calls.
Record your message at the tone.
I spent weeks looking through newspaper archives and calling LA County office buildings about this alleged death.
I've been having trouble verifying this claim, and I'm curious if there's any records at your office that can help me.
I did get one simple note back from the LA County Tax Assessor's office. Was unsuccessful to find any information on this. The thing is, Michael Grotz thinks making up stories is part of Howard's whole strategy.
Stories trump data, and the opponents of tax increases have been much more effective in marshaling stories.
He recruited the exaggerated stories of old people eating cat food and dying in the Hall of Administration to great success. His movement started gaining momentum. In 1968, Jarvis decided to try to get a measure to limit taxes on the California state ballot. His idea to create a proposition isn't new. Movements to create ballot initiatives to limit taxes actually go back to the 1930s. He got the idea from his buddy and collaborator Phil Watson, who was a tax assessor in LA County, sympathetic to his cause. To Jarvis, at least in the way he tells his story, this ballot measure was important. He He saw himself as standing up for the common man, that everyday Californian who was being squeezed by the bureaucrats, and he saw this as the people's way of fighting back. But initiatives didn't happen often. Between 1960 and 78, only 31 initiatives even made it on the ballot. Voters approved 7. But it was still possible. Anyone with charisma and elbow grease could conceivably get a measure passed. Jarvis had both, and he was determined. He toiled for 15 years, petitioning and advocating for ballot measures, including one sponsored by Ronald Reagan to limit the income tax.
But income taxes didn't catch on.
Even Ronald Reagan himself couldn't sell tax cuts to Californians until fate stepped in.
The American automobile, for so long the symbol of America's wealth and extravagance, is dying.
In 1973, OPEC, a coalition of oil exporting countries, waged a total embargo against any country that supported Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, including the USA.
The global economy exploded.
The term stagflation entered the zeitgeist, which means inflation and high unemployment. And in America, wages and jobs stalled. The effects of this global recession were hitting property owners nationwide. And to understand why, we have to follow the butterfly effect back to 1966. In San Francisco, the city assessor was convicted of bribery. Basically, the guy who told people what their property was worth was getting paid off to cook more favorable assessments in exchange for cash. It was a common practice happening all over the state. The Democratic governor, Pat Brown, tried to reform the broken system with a law. He was actually hesitant to do that out of fear of being blamed for raising everybody's taxes. And that's a dynamic you see play out in politics today. But the corruption scandal made the issue so prominent, Brown eventually changed course.
As so often happens with laws, the law sort of backfired and actually ended up shifting more of the tax burden to homeowners.
That's because it modernized an outdated system. There was now no limit to how much assessors could raise property taxes on individuals. So people were facing property tax bills that were doubling or even tripling.
Bobby Seale, the Black Panther leader, has been in trouble with the law for many years. And now he wants to be mayor of Oakland, California, where the Black Panther movement began.
Progressives had their eye on the ball. In 1973, Bobby Seale ran for mayor of Oakland on a platform that included lowering and limiting property taxes. And then, since the global economy collapsing wasn't enough, Watergate.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
We had a corrupt president followed by an unelected president. And meanwhile, Howard Jarvis was on TV. His popular takedowns of government employees fanned the flames of brewing cynicism.
Just go over there this morning to City Council's office, and you walk through 15 City Councilmen's office. You'll see more people asleep and reading Playboy than you do in a hotel.
One of Jarvis's talking points was that because he was already rich, he was more trustworthy than public servants and politicians who were being bankrolled by taxpayers. But Jack Anderson, a famous investigative journalist, explored Jarvis's allegedly shady background as a campaign fundraiser. Jarvis claimed to raise money for Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign and the campaign of a California Republican senator.
He was a bit of a grifter. Neither campaign said they ever got the money.
The Goldwater campaign sued Jarvis's organization, which made him quietly stop collecting money.
Jarvis, of course, denied all of this.
Jarvis's ballot measure was called the Jarvis-Gann Initiative. Paul Gann, Jarvis's less charismatic Northern California counterpart, also helped author the initiative, so his name's also on it. The petition seemed like a simple measure to limit property taxes on the surface, but Jarvis hid some really important Easter eggs in there.
Hi, I'm John Kupal. Most Californians have heard about Proposition 13.
To help explain, here's an informational video from the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association itself, the anti-tax lobbying group created in 1978.
First, it limits the tax rate on all California property to 1% of value, which, for homes, is usually the purchase price.
Plus, the assessed value can't grow more than 2% a year. Jarvis's logic was that if you decide a home is worth $80,000, he sets his own price and he sets his own taxes.
Now, your taxes are limited by what you are willing to pay for your home and are not subject to the ever-changing real estate market.
Anyone who bought a house in 1978 will effectively get a big tax break in the upcoming decades. It applies to commercial property too, because it's only fair to give business owners a tax break. You only lose the tax break if you sell the property and then it gets reassessed. But Jarvis also wanted to limit any new taxes.
But Howard Jarvis wrote Proposition 13 so it helps taxpayers in other ways too.
So he wrote it into the petition that any state tax needs a 2/3 supermajority of both houses of the legislature. Same for any tax levied by local governments.
And voters now have a greater say in whether or not new taxes will be passed.
Despite the movement's democratic and even populist ideals, Jarvis strived to make cutting taxes easier than raising them.
For 25 years, we've had increasing taxes on properties. Now it's a chance for the people to say something about it.
He learned that the best approach to get somebody to sign your petition was to just go up and say, "Hey, sign this. It'll help lower your taxes." Petition volunteers hit people door to door, the sprawling shopping malls. Meanwhile, Jarvis hit the right-wing AM talk radio stations and staged press conferences, like in the CBS clip.
We got a lot of marinated bureaucrats in government, and they are on a big gravy train. They're all overpaid and underworked, and they don't want to get off this gravy train.
He even tried to run for mayor of LA.
I'm just a little farmer from Utah, and I'm no different than anybody else. I'm the last thing from a right-winger.
By the end of 1977, signatures poured in, enough to make it on the ballot. And the Jarvis-Gann initiative became Prop 13.
People have the rare and no doubt pleasing opportunity to vote their taxes down, to tell the politicians that they will pay this much and no more. Proposition 13 it's called.
But Jarvis would need a lot more people on board to win the election. So fueled by housing prices, he went to work. He debated county officials, school superintendents, Leo McCarthy, the Speaker of the California State Assembly, like in the CBS clip.
I know something about local government. I know people want some control over local government.
You see, Mr. McCarthy, we are not interested at all in making supervisors and city councilmen happy. That is not what we're after.
We're interested in running decent
We hope we
government.
can make them a little unhappy.
He was a great interview. He usually walked away thinking, well, you know, I don't quite believe everything Howard is saying, but he looks like he pretty much won. You know, the other person sitting there with a notebook trying to make points, and, you know, when you're explaining, you're losing.
And what do you think about the chaos they say you are causing?
Well, I think the only chaos will be that the politicians will have to go back to work.
Howard was not explaining, he was ranting and raving, but he was doing it with great effectiveness.
Big businesses, mainstream politicians, the media, notably the LA Times, opposed Prop 13. The paper would publish op-eds saying it'd create massive layoffs in the public sector that relied on the property tax. Jarvis called these claims hysterical and even said, "I think the Los Angeles Times is the enemy of the people." Schools and hospitals staged protests.
If Proposition 13 passes, the impact on the children of this community will be tragic.
And in early 1978, these arguments were working. Prop 13 seemed like an extreme solution to the property tax problem. But then 6 weeks before the election, the spring property tax bills went out.
And the new assessments reflect 3 more years of rising inflation in housing prices.
That's Bob Kuttner. He's a journalist, historian, and founder of the Economic Policy Institute. He wrote his first book, Revolt of the Haves, about the California tax revolt.
The assessments for Los Angeles County, which has the hottest housing market, they come out only 6 weeks before the vote on Prop 13. There are camera crews staking out the assessor's office, and there are people coming out with their new tax bill just in tears, and people saying, "I'm going to lose my home." Proposition 13 surges 20 points in the polls.
California voters were getting mad as hell. To Bob Kuttner, this is a classic allegory.
When the political mainstream doesn't pay attention to people being taxed out of their homes because the tax system is grossly unfair, that opens the door to fringe figures with crazy remedies.
And as NBC's David Brinkley reported on the eve of the Prop 13 election,
it is thought to be about as much a vote against big, expensive, wasteful government as it is against the property tax. And it seems that nobody loves government anymore.
Democrats, renters, even government employees, some of whom were bound to lose their jobs due to reduced tax revenue, voted for Prop 13, and Jarvis's bet paid off. People were more afraid of losing their homes than their jobs. People like my grandfather, Mort Markowitz, who worked in the water department for San Francisco.
He was civil servant. He always had a job. We just didn't worry that he was going to be unemployed. And that was a nice thing. It's not the same today, of course.
My grandmother, Marilyn, purchased her North Berkeley home in 1971 for around $30,000.
We borrowed from Mort's father for the down payment. So we chose it basically that we wanted to be able to walk to synagogue. We were able to do it even with our young children.
She doesn't remember seeing Howard Jarvis on TV, and right-wing AM talk radio isn't really part of her kosher media diet.
He'd be like, lower taxes.
He was like a clown.
He was a bit of a clown, yeah.
She found out about Prop 13 through conversations with her friends, fellow Berkeley liberals who were concerned about public school funding.
When I found out that, this Proposition 13, that I wouldn't maybe have to pay as much in property taxes, that was something to think about, right?
Marilyn doesn't remember exactly how she and my grandfather voted back in '78, but she's pretty sure it was a yes for Prop 13. And Mort didn't lose his job.
I look at my taxes now and I think, oh, thank goodness for Proposition 13, because they would even be higher without it.
Fact of the matter is, when there's a tax cut for yourself on the ballot, it's hard to vote it down. Michael Grotz says this is par for the course.
It's a very difficult communication problem when you start talking about paying for government. People would rather have a government they don't pay for it.
Sometimes it just seems that it's really hard not to vote for your self-interest. And and that's too bad because you make big mistakes that way.
After the break, we're talking to the godfather of supply-side economics and how he convinced the Brown political dynasty to embrace tax cuts.
Jarvis is no longer viewed as the tax-cutting old kook, but as a genuine political hero.
Weeks before Prop 13 passed in the June primary election, the governor of California, Pat Brown's son, Jerry Brown, decided to stop pushing his own version of tax relief through the state legislature and fully support Prop 13.
I have adopted a strategy of focusing maximum public pressure in the hopes that will bring about property tax relief sooner.
He even asked Howard Jarvis to endorse him in the election later that year.
Some people didn't believe me when I said Proposition 13 would work, but I knew it would, and I knew Governor Brown was the man who could make it work.
That ad helped Jerry Brown stay in power.
It was a political boon for the campaign.
Todd Holmes is a professor at UC Berkeley, and he interviewed Jerry Brown for his oral history. He told me that supporting tax cuts was in line with his whole political philosophy.
Jerry Brown at his core is fiscally conservative.
In his first term as governor, he gave away his free Disney tickets, the private jet, the Sacramento governor's mansion, and he slept on the floor of an apartment on a mattress.
There's no frills involved.
Jerry also dated Linda Ronstadt, the famous singer, who once berated him during a concert for spending more time running for president and not enough time with her.
He went out to run for president for the last couple of months, and hadn't been for the fact that I got to see him on TV every night, I forgot what he looked like.
Linda wasn't Jerry's only problem. He was knocked for focusing on national issues and ignoring local ones, like the property tax explosion. And he caught some serious flack from fellow Democrats for supporting Prop 13.
Art Agnos, who was a very powerful Democrat, was quoted in the paper saying his behavior in the post-Prop 13 political arena has been shameless. It's one thing to accept defeat graciously, but another to politically prostitute yourself and those who have caused so much damage to the constituency, which has been so loyal to your political career. Blacks, Chicanos.
To Art and other Democrats, supporting Prop 13 meant directly taking money out of the pockets of public schools that served California's diverse population.
Brown didn't lift a finger to prevent Prop 13 from happening.
Bob Kuttner also sees Brown's endorsement of 13 as a surrender.
And shame on him.
Jerry Brown, the tax revolt's first Democratic champion. He certainly won't be the last, but we'll save that for the next episode. The Prop 13 election was on June 6, 1978, D-Day. Jarvis campaigned right up until the polls closed at 8 p.m. that night. It was a landslide, a 2-1 victory.
It's kind of like a Boston Tea Party that we were saying we've had it.
Immediately, property taxes shrank back to their 76 rates, and Jarvis waltzed onto the national stage.
I saved homeowners. Now what we did, we made it impossible to sell people's home to pay for welfare for illegal aliens.
The little farmer from Utah took his perspective to international television.
Proposition 13 sort of made him famous. He had his photo on Time magazine after it was enacted with a big yellow banner saying Tax Revolt with his picture.
In 1979, Jarvis was runner-up for Time's Man of the Year, but he lost to Ayatollah Khomeini, the Iranian revolutionary.
I am forming the American Tax Reduction Movement for the United States.
So like a true revolutionary, Jarvis made a TV special introducing his plan to cut $100 billion in federal spending.
Within 4 years after 13 was enacted, 34 states enacted either supermajority requirements or property tax limitations.
Jarvis types even duplicated in other states and created their own ballot initiatives. There was Douglas Bruce in Colorado, Barbara Anderson in Massachusetts.
This is going to be introduced pretty soon in Michigan, Oklahoma, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania.
The tax-cutting movement developed a life outside of Jarvis's wildest dreams.
The thing is just sweeping the country, and it's beyond my capacity to really comprehend it, if you want to know the truth about it.
After Prop 13 passed, Milton Friedman, the influential Chicago school economist, complained in a Newsweek article that Prop 13 didn't go after the more insidious forms of taxation.
He was wrong on all of those things. Property tax is probably the single worst tax in the history of humanity.
That's Art Laffer. If his name sounds familiar to you, it's because he's another influential supply-side academic. In 1974, he scribbled a parabola on a napkin. That curve was then rebranded as the Laffer curve. It's Laffer's way of demonstrating lower taxation actually boosts the economy and government revenue. It's a contested claim, to say the least.
I got picketed, by the way, by all the teachers in my kids' schools. My kids would say, "Dad, that's my math teacher standing out there yelling at you." Oh, goodness gracious.
Laffer got his PhD from Stanford, which he said was full of Marxists, and he was actually teaching at the University of Southern California when Prop 13 passed. And Laffer loved Prop 13, loved it enough to write an academic paper supporting it. He explained that the money people would save from property tax would revitalize the economy.
I think I got 3,000 requests in the first week for that paper. It just went viral in that day and age. So I became literally the third spokesman for Proposition 13.
But his opinion wasn't popular.
Everyone was screaming and hollering, this is the end of the world. There was the UCLA model which said that we'd lose all this jobs and everything, all silly stuff. And they didn't know what they were doing. They're not well-trained economists at UCLA. And all of that's not true.
Laffer had really made a name for himself with his pro-Prop 13 economic argument. So when it did pass, Governor Jerry Brown called him up.
The governor, Jerry Brown, said, Arthur, I want you to come up here to Sacramento. I want to make sure this thing works, and I want to implement it correctly, and I'd like to have you first thing up in the morning. And I said, well, let me see if I can get a ticket. He says, you've got one already. I bought it for you. It's waiting at the airport, the 6 a.m. flight to Sacramento.
He spent 3 days with Jerry Brown and his team, coming up with a plan to keep the schools and public facilities open.
We allocated the funds pro rata to the cities, counties, and local districts in proportion to the loss of their revenues.
And according to Laffer, the results were immediate and oh so sweet.
It was just a terrific thing. Prosperity came in. It was a win, 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 win across the board. And to this day, Proposition 13 is sacrosanct. It is just the most magnificent piece of legislation I've ever seen.
Supporting Prop 13 helped make Art Laffer famous.
It got me to be quite well known. I could walk down the streets in New York. Cops would come up to me and thank me. And I mean, it was just incredible. How can this little short, ugly economist get that type of notoriety? But that's what happened.
He then went on to advise Ronald Reagan, partly because of nepotism.
My godfather was Justin Dart, as you may know, who was head of Reagan's kitchen cabinet.
And according to Laffer, Reagan wasn't all in on cutting taxes at first. He was mostly big on social issues like anti-communism and law and order, but with a little bit of convincing.
He changed his paradigm 100%. And fortunately, I was very involved with him in that process. And Reagan did this 180 pivot on economics and became the most pro-growth, democratic, economic, free market capitalist president in U.S. history.
Art Laffer also continued to advise the tax policies of Jerry Brown and helped him devise a flat tax plan when he ran for president in 1992. And finally, after Prop 13 passed, Laffer got to meet his compatriot, Howard Jarvis. He always thought Jarvis was a little rough around the edges.
I can remember one team watching him on TV picking his nose. I mean, that was not what my mom had raised me to believe was the right thing to do. But then after the election, I got very close to him. Very smart guy. He was a little crude, a little crass, but hell, he was really smart.
Together, Laffer and Jarvis made a bigger impact on history than anyone would have been able to foresee.
Once upon a time, 4 long years ago, most Americans could dream of owning a home. But Jimmy Carter's runaway inflation, with record high interest rates and a lack of mortgage money, has slammed the door on that dream.
Concerns over housing and inflation were paramount in the 1980 presidential election. Art Laffer suggested that Reagan's platform should include tax cuts. So Reagan made an ad blaming stagflation that cranked up the housing prices on the Carter administration's policies.
I pledge to all Americans that we'll get inflation under control and keep it under control, so you can save for the home of your dreams.
When Reagan won on a landslide, he said he couldn't have done it without grassroots support.
And let me just say from the bottom of my heart that we would never come as far as we have today without the support of you, the American people.
President Reagan invited Howard Jarvis to the White House in 1981. There's a picture of them shaking hands, looking happy and kind of rosy. Jarvis died in 1986, long enough afterward to see his work influence one of Reagan's signature pieces of legislation, a landmark tax cut in 1981. And now, Jarvis's favorite talking points live rent-free in our politics.
But we're going to find out where that money's going, and it's not going to be pretty. By slashing all of the fraud, waste, and theft we can find, we will defeat inflation, bring down mortgage rates, lower car payments.
One of the main things he pushed was the idea that governments are wasteful and fraudulent. I just keep thinking about that young guy from Utah who just got his latex ripped away and saw it turn into mush. Now, California commercial property owners save an extra $6 to $11 billion annually thanks to Prop 13. And the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association is a powerful political force in California. In 2022, they helped block a wealth tax on people who made $2 million or more that would have subsidized electric vehicles and given money to local fire departments. I talked to a few previous members of the association. People didn't want to go on the record, but I received this message from their current head of communications, Susan Shelley. She said, Prop 13 continues to protect Californians from uncontrolled tax increases from the property they own. That was Jarvis's mission in the 1970s, and it remains the mission of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association today. Prop 13 did help some people stay in their homes, But when Jerry Brown and Art Laffer redistributed state funds, they fundamentally realigned California's financial bones.
Prop 13 cuts the rate to 1%. And so that has a few big consequences, expected and unexpected, right?
To find out how Prop 13 impacted California, I called up Darian Shansky. Shansky lives in Davis, California, and teaches law students about taxes. He also used to help city governments manage their finances, which made him intimately familiar with Prop 13. Remember, Laffer and Brown reallocated funds in proportion to the city's lost revenues. The problem is, California still divvies up that money the way we did it in '78.
Once that's set in place, and it's a zero-sum game where every entity gets their share of the pie, it's very hard to change. Because now if the school district gets a few cents more, who's losing? The city, the county, the fire district? There's just no rhyme or reason for it.
Now, cities rely on that chunk of cash from the state of California to pay for services like public schools. California collects income, corporate, and sales tax, which are volatile funding during a recession.
Therefore, when the state gets a cold, these smaller entities get, a fever.
If low-income cities want to fund their own schools and fire departments, they have to get a little crafty.
Cities have an incentive, right, to find money where they can, which is often through the sales tax.
For example, Dinuba, California, a small town of 25,000 people in the Central Valley, made a deal with Best Buy that funnels sales tax revenue into the city in return for a tax break for Best Buy. That's all thanks to an often used California loophole.
They're in a very tough spot, and there should be some other way for them to foster development other than to cannibalize the sales tax.
Professor Shansky researches a lot of these loopholes, and he has his own ideas on how we can modernize our current system. But in Shansky's opinion, the 2/3 provision in Prop 13 is the worst hurdle. You need a supermajority to raise any tax. So in other words, 1/3 of Californians that oppose any tax based on principle can effectively block the state from raising any money.
It's like anytime you want to raise a tax, you need like a whole populist movement to like rally behind it.
Exactly. So it's totally asymmetrical.
My grandmother's home is now valued at over $1 million, though she pays tax as if it were worth $72,000.
Our society is just, it's just harder to do the things that were just normal. You know, when I was in my 20s, I don't know if that's good. I think it's bad.
Prop 13 helps people like my grandmother, but it also gave way to a kind of family tree of loopholes and laws. Children and grandchildren that inherit property from the OG 13ers want to keep their hands on their parents' tax breaks because otherwise they just can't afford a house.
You can't underestimate the optimism of people who think they're climbing up the ladder.
Laffer and Jarvis promised a strong economy that would help people afford homes in California. The opposite became true.
The ladder has become much harder to climb this century than it was in the past, and that goes back to the 1970s.
Who believe that they're victims, who believe that government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. But it's an entitlement, and the government should give it to them.
In 2012, during a leaked campaign fundraiser with wealthy donors, Mitt Romney claimed that 47% of Americans don't pay any income tax, that those Americans feel entitled to government services even though they don't contribute to society. But the granddaddy of this rhetoric was Howard Jarvis. He blazed the trail for a powerful lineage to follow.
You know, I've been around the tax business for a long time.
Michael Grotz told me that the tax revolt didn't happen overnight. Since the 1980s, a small coalition of radical tax cutters hijacked American politics to effectively block any new tax.
I kept asking people to name a social and political movement, and people said the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, the MAGA movement, the environmental movement. I never heard the anti-tax. Nobody ever mentioned the anti-tax movement. And yet I thought, you know, the anti-tax movement is the only movement among those that has not suffered a major setback. I'm an optimist by nature. I've been an optimist my entire life. But it's very hard to see how this stops.
Next up on Lever Time, what happens when Howard Jarvis's tax revolt goes national, and how it brought down a Republican president.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is part of the Lever's investigative newsroom and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by me, Ariella Markowitz, with help from Natalie Bettendorf and Arjun Singh. It was fact-checked by Chris Walker. It had editing support from Joel Warner, Lucy Dean Stockton, Jared Amar, and David Sirota. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.